Hello, welcome to the Future of Reason podcast. My name is David, and I'm here with Kyle and Jonathan. This is a new project for us, and it's a work in progress. So forgive us if it's a little rough at first, but we are going to try to polish it up with the help of all of you. So this is uh, a project, sort of an offshoot from a Facebook group that we are all involved in called Sam Harris and the Future of Reason. We will be opening up debates and discussions to other members. Whoever is interested can just let us know through that group, private message us, or just post about it. So today, we're going to start with a debate between Kyle and Jonathan over the issue of religion. Is religion an adaptation, or is it a spandrel? Uh, Biological adaptation that helps, or a spandrel? Each of the debaters will get a 5 minute or up to 5 minutes opening statement, and then we're going to just sort of let it roll as a friendly debate, trying to do it in the spirit of the Sam Harris podcast and hopefully keep it interesting. So without any further ado, we'll hand it off to Kyle and his opening statement.
Cool. Thanks, Dave. That was a cool opening. Okay. So, in this debate, I'm going to be arguing that the Spandrel view of religion is just, it's not the strongest or the most plausible view of evolution, of religion. It's not the strongest or the most plausible view of the evolution of religion. Although we do seek elegant solutions that require the least amount of assumptions, what we really want from an explanation is for it to, we want it to be as explanatory as possible for whatever the phenomenon is that we're trying to describe and explain. We want it to be able to make predictions about the future, which in this case means predictions about human behavior. We know that the fundamental principle of biology is Darwinism, other than all of the specifics like cells, chemical reactions, organic chemistry, etc. In this debate, I will seek to expose the Spandrel view of evolution as being comparable to pre-Darwinian ideas of biology. I guess you could say that I'm pursuing the tack that Jonathan is not enough of a Darwinian. I thought that would be quite comical.
Jesus, you went there.
And I just want to say props to everyone that got that reference.
Yeah, no, that was good.
What I mean by this is that the Spandrel view is an instance of not being able to see the forest for the trees. Jonathan and I will probably agree on a number of points and yet disagree on the existence of a level of selection above that of the organism, that which could be called a kind of group selection. I'm seeking to demonstrate the existence of this level and to show that religion is an adaptation that has been spread to Homo sapiens as a meme, with religion being a particularly effective meme. As of 2017, something approaching 90% of all humans could be described as religious. This number varies depending on how exactly you cut the definition of religion, whether you include quasi-religions like secular Buddhism, New Age spirituality, woo-woo nonsense, and communism. For this, we're going to use the narrow definition of religion, which is the belief in and/or worship of supernatural agents. When looking at biology through the lens of evolutionary theory, it's always a hard sell to say that something so ubiquitous is not adaptive. Although there does exist a wide variety of religious beliefs, surely if religion were merely a spandrel, we would not see so many recurring themes. We would not see so many religions placing such emphasis on disgust, on interpersonal morality, group cohesion, theories about life after death that provide comfort. A quote that I like is that we are chimpanzees driven mad by self-awareness. As far as we know, we're the only animal to ever intentionally end our own life. Many famous stories feature characters driven mad by nihilism, by impending death, by perceiving existence itself as pointless. Religiosity seems highly correlated with life circumstances. The more challenges someone is facing in their life, the more religious they're likely to be. Atheism seems to be something of a bourgeois phenomenon. Why would this be? Well, humans are highly emotional and cognitively complicated creatures. We appear to need many things: community, meaning, a system of altruistic morality that doesn't require a university degree to understand. We seem to have needs that need to be taken care of. I seek to argue that prior to something more akin to classical liberalism, modern-day humanism, an understanding of the scientific nature of the universe, that religion served this purpose best, and that as a consequence of the fact that we seem to be unable to get along in our life without religion prior to fairly recently, religion is most certainly an adaptive feature of evolutionary biology. And that's it.
Okay, now for Jonathan.
Okay, well, I've decided that instead of responding directly to your remarks, that I would just lay out a summary argument for my case and a cursory description of what a spandrel is and how it comes about, so that I can get this out of the way and we can have this discussion in a more meaningful way. Let's see. In 2001, the French-American psychologist Pascal Boyer published a book entitled Religion Explained, in which he draws from an increasingly robust body of literature in the cognitive sciences to argue that religion is best explained as an evolutionary byproduct. Boyer's ideas, which invoke the incredibly influential work of Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin, were quickly embraced by a vast majority of cognitive scientists and evolutionary biologists as the standard model in the evolutionary psychology of religion, and for very good reason. In contrast to the adaptationist model, the standard model is predicated on empirical data from a variety of fields, including biological anthropology, cultural anthropology, linguistics, neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, information processing, and so on. Using this broad data set, the standard model posits that religion is a parasitic offshoot of various cognitive inference systems that we developed during the most critically formative stage of our evolutionary history. As Scott Tran puts it, religion ensues from the ordinary workings of the human mind as it deals with emotionally compelling problems of human existence. The idea is that our heightened sensitivity to agent detection, which is the intuitive modular process of assuming the purposeful intervention of intelligence or agency, even in situations where neither are present, is responsible for culturally ubiquitous beliefs in supernatural agents. These beliefs manifest in various ways in individuals, but they're inevitably shared with others and become subject to a social phenomenon called folk ontology, which is yet another side effect of the prefrontal cortex. Folk ontology is a process by which ideas and beliefs regarding the nature of reality are propagated culturally by individuals and modified by the community into a single unified narrative. The group adopts this narrative, and it comes to define everything about them. It inexorably becomes entangled with cultural expressions of human nature, such as ethics, our need for ritual, our deference to authority, our tribal identity, and etc. And the rest is history. The value of this model is in its elegance and its simplicity, in its ability to explain the origins of religion by invoking mechanisms and cultural phenomena for which ample evidence already exists. The cognitive sciences have already provided us with a well-documented account of the inner workings of the prefrontal cortex, and the conclusions of the standard model seamlessly conform to findings in all of the relevant fields. The adaptationist model, on the other hand, of necessity mechanisms for which we have no empirical account. Whether it's additional levels of selection or even the specific mechanisms of selection, the adaptationist account of religion depends on a number of model-based assumptions and suffers mightily for it. As Steven Pinker has readily pointed out, None of the adaptationist explanations are very persuasive. No one has been able to so much as provide an a priori reason as to why a belief in an untrue proposition would serve an adaptive role in getting organisms to cooperate. If there's already a sub-goal in evolution to get individual organisms to cooperate and outcompeting common enemies, why would a belief in a soul or ritual or a god be necessary in cementing a sense of community? Especially when we already have emotions like trust, loyalty, compassion, love, fairness, and equality, emotions that the prefrontal cortex evolved to accommodate. On the one hand, you have a theory that comprehensively details the precise mechanisms by which religion might have emerged by citing a body of evidence that continues to grow every day. And on the other, you have a model that struggles to make sense of itself. There you go.
Okay, well, I guess we're going to open this up to just a discussion, and I guess going with Kyle might have a response.
Yeah, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to take on more of a character of trying to poke holes and ask pointed questions in Jonathan's speech. So, what a priori assumptions were you referring to specifically in the adaptive model?
Well, there's typically, to qualify as an adaptation, something like religion has to meet certain criteria. One of those criteria is that there can be a demonstrable line drawn from the cause to the effect, just theoretically or hypothetically. All of the explanations given for religion as an adaptation are post hoc. It's someone observing this phenomenon from afar and observing that it has these effects, that it's doing something that seems to be useful. But kinds of useful things that aren't adaptive. And there's no reason to assume that religion would have these effects. All the explanations, all the lines of reasoning put forth to explain religion as an adaptation or post hoc, ex post facto justifications.
Okay, so what you're saying
So,
is
yeah,
that religion, what you're saying is that the adaptive model of religion, it doesn't draw a cause and effect line that can be evaluated without first looking at the effects backwards, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
All right, so what's an example of an adaptation that is uncontrovertibly an adaptation, that you can draw a line, cause and effect from the cause of the adaptation to be evolved and then the effect of the adaptation? What's an example of one that is doesn't have those kind of post hoc assumptions?
Well, for instance, agent detection is one I just cited in my opening speech, but it's an adaptation that confers demonstrable benefits that we can look at, we can understand, and we can measure. And we don't have to look at the effects backwards. We don't have to look at the effect and then decide how the cause could have come to create that effect. We can look at the cause and analyze it and come to the conclusion that this is a cause that would have this effect. And once the prediction we make based on that information, based on that analysis, is vindicated, then that's one criterion for judging something as an adaptation. And that's something that religion can't do, and it never has done. And no one can look at religion and say that this is the cause or this is the effect that religion is having. And this is why it was selected for in the first place. That's why it's an adaptation. It's all just theoretical, it's all based on this assumption.
Can I just jump in and ask you to clarify, Jonathan, for layman like myself, although I think I know what you're talking about. What do you mean when you say the adaptation of being able to detect an agent? You're talking about danger?
Yeah, well, agent selection was it's our tendency to attribute agency to inanimate objects or natural events, and we developed
What I
that.
mean is, I understand that. What I mean is, what would be the benefit of that? Wouldn't that be like in a social situation, trying to figure out what's in the mind of other people to predict their actions, and the consequence of that is to
Yeah,
protect
so
inanimate objects? Or are you saying to
No,
detect inanimate objects is actually an adaptation?
no, yeah, I was getting that. The point is that it was an overcorrection. So you can imagine early human beings on the African savannah, constantly encountering predators, right? Michael, what's the guy's name? I can't remember his name at the moment, but so we're constantly encountering predators on the African savannah, and so those of us who respond to a noise, say the wind through the trees or a pine cone in the African savannah, um, our response to that was significant. And those of us who were more likely to flee because we assumed that this noise or that whatever was occurring was a predator were more likely to pass on our genes. And so it was sort of overcorrection, right?
yeah, it's better off to assume it is an agent than to assume that it's not. Because if you assume that it is and it's a false positive, then okay, you just wasted your time for a few minutes, you got a little startle, and then okay, big deal, move on. But if you assume that it's not, and then holy shit, it is, well, then you're done for. So more false positives are going to be selected for than false negatives. And so humans would then inevitably have a propensity to assume false positives and false negatives because the false positives would outcompete the false negatives.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so, and agent, I don't know if you were specifically asking about what an agent is, and for anyone listening who doesn't know as well.
No, I'm trying to clarify it just
Yeah.
in case anyone didn't catch that, but I recall Daniel Dennett speaking of something similar in a book I read, Breaking the Spell.
Yes.
And but I just wanted you to go into the relationship of what that meant, that that selecting or detecting agency is an adaptation.
Yeah.
So that much you both agree on, or Kyle, were you trying to explain it to me?
Yeah, we both agree. That's basically incontrovertible that humans have a hyperactive agent detection. That's fairly incontrovertible. We can demonstrate that in all situations, so that's not a contention.
Yeah.
Okay, I will let you guys continue. Sorry.
No problem.
No problem.
Okay, so so what's a prediction you can glean from religion being, if religion's just a spandrel, then why is it so hard to get rid of? Why is it so ubiquitous? And why does it seem to confer an advantage? And if we can go into the situations where it confers an advantage, or what, if you want to, if that's the point you want to contend, and that's where we want to plant the flag, then we can do that.
Yeah, no. This is a criticism that adaptationists often raise about the spandrel model, and Russell Powell and Steve Clark actually wrote a paper on this where
That almost sounds like a pejorative. Adaptationist.
well, that's being inferred, deliberately. But in their paper, they surmise that because certain aspects of religion or the religious impulse are so ubiquitous, that's indicative of it being an adaptation. But it's not necessarily the case. I mean, religion is a byproduct that rides the coattails of the inner workings of the prefrontal cortex. And so this is machinery that drives our behavior at a fundamental level, right? So, I mean, I referred to agent detection. There's the theory of mind. Without the theory of mind, I mean, we wouldn't be where we are. We wouldn't have we wouldn't have been able to construct rudimentary tribes, I mean, let alone create something like a sprawling metropolis. But my point is that the hardware that religion is riding the coattails of, it's innate and it's fundamental, and
So what
without it,
hardware is religion riding the coattails of? You mentioned the prefrontal cortex. So just a quick aside. I'm not a neuroscientist. I wish I was. I tend to view the human mind as something of an analogy of a computer, where you have the hardware and then you have the software. Because for example, we all have basically the same hardware, but I'm thinking one thing at the moment, you're thinking another thing, and that's the software that we're both running.
Yeah.
And I think I think as almost like a direct analog of a computer, where someone who's a communist is running a specific kind of software. I would say a Trojan horse, a malignant virus in that case, but so something fairly simple like disgust. I've been listening to a lot about disgust recently, so I think that is something I could probably work with pretty well. Something like disgust. What is the difference between the hardware that's responsible for disgust? Because I mean, we've shown that you can cut out certain parts of the brain and change the actual workings of the brain. And there's lots of examples of this having a very profound effect. We hear all the time about instances like the guy with the tumor in his brain, and he basically became a psycho. And so that's the obvious example. So what is the hardware analog of religion then? And how does that, and how is, what's the division between the hardware analog of religion, the cause of religion, its hardware, and the software? Could we have the same hardware producing different software in different circumstances?
Well, yeah, and we do. There are certain features that are ubiquitous, as you said, that are cultural universals, but religion manifests individually, independently, in strikingly dissimilar ways. And there are religions that have no analog to the Western monotheistic God. They don't. There's no agent or force at the core of them at all, and there are religions that don't stress the importance of culture, or of community, and religions that don't stress so much the importance of ritual. So, I mean, these things. It's not like that the religious phenotype, if you want to call it that, expresses itself in exactly the same way cross-culturally. There are certain features that almost inevitably occur as a result of the inner workings of the prefrontal cortex. And, because agent detection, that's almost always going to lead in a culture with folk ontology to the belief in some sort of agent or invisible intelligence. But the characteristics of that agent is always going to be there are always going to be disparities, and ritual comes from the culture, not necessarily from the religious impulse. They're non-religious cultures that still find an importance in ritual. So if you're asking why these things seem so similar when it's hardware that shouldn't necessarily entail these striking similarities, my answer is just that they're not as similar as you might think.
Okay, so if there, I'm not entirely sure of which religions you're referring to. I'm assuming the easiest example is like what I mentioned, like secular Buddhism. That you mentioned there's like
Yeah.
Eastern religions that have no resemblance at all to Western monotheistic religions. And so what is the Spandrel's view of an Eastern religion that doesn't really have any emphasis on agents at all?
What could you rephrase that? Could you
Okay.
repeat it?
What would the Spandrel argument say to the Eastern religions that don't have any agency and any external supernatural agents involved in the religious belief? For religions that don't have really any emphasis on external agents, they don't really have a god. What is the purpose of them then in terms of the Spandrel? Well, not the purpose. Sorry. What is the underlying cause of those religions if they don't have anything to do with hyperactive agency detection? Then why are they occurring?
Well, it's still HADD or HAAD manifesting itself in different ways. It's just it doesn't take the form of an a supernatural agent. It can
I'm
take the
just
form
going
of
to interrupt and say HAAD is hyperactive.
agency detection. Yeah,
Hyperactive agency detection. In other words, being the overcorrection you were talking about earlier.
yeah, exactly.
Okay,
It's
that's
just
all. I just wanted to clarify that for listeners.
yeah. No, I was just trying to be brief. Sorry.
Yeah, I
But
figured
yeah,
that out.
it's still agent detection is just manifesting in slightly different ways. So it could think karma. It's they're still attributing some sort of supernatural cause to things that happen in the world, but it's not necessarily an anthropomorphic figure. It's just a force or a process that guides the world and sort of maintains order.
I mean,
And so
we both accept that karma is just, well, it doesn't exist. There's no reason to think that karma exists, but I don't.
yeah,
I mean, if you take like an economic system, and so I know that economics is a fairly modern thing, but if you take an economic system like supply and demand affecting the price of something, what's the difference
yeah,
between that as a non-anthropomorphic agent? Because I mean, supply and demand is a thing; it exists. It's causing an observable effect that we can see. What's the difference
yeah,
between that and karma? I mean, karma obviously doesn't exist,
yeah,
but what's the difference between if someone looked at the world around them and they said, there must be supply and demand at the root of what I'm observing, and they'd be correct. They wouldn't
yeah.
have 100 years of economic theory leading up to that idea. They just realized it all of a sudden and came up with this idea. What's the difference between someone who's done that and the people who realized, in quotes, that karma exists?
So you asking why people don't attribute supernatural causes to things like supply and demand?
I'm I'm clumsily trying to ask what's the difference between supply and demand and karma, other than the fact that one exists and one doesn't.
I'm trying my best to answer that, but I'm not really sure what you mean.
Okay, so I mean,
I
like you're saying that karma is an instance of our hyperactive agency detection.
Yeah.
It's just not anthropomorphized. So why couldn't you say the same thing about supply and demand? That it's just hyperactive agency detection that's not anthropomorphized. Is the distinction simply that one exists and one doesn't?
No, I think I see what you're saying now. I think the best explanation of that is that a theory of mind actually allows us to identify when other human beings are at the, when they're responsible for certain events and certain actions. And so we recognize that something like supply and demand is a real force that's causing certain effects. We can trace that back to human origin, but whereas karma is an attempt by human beings to explain the nature of reality. It's an attempt to explain why things are the way they are, and karma it's obviously not traceable back to human beings because as you and I agree, it doesn't exist. But it's also it's not meant to explain banal earthly phenomena. It's meant to explain everything. Like it's meant to explain why things happen to people the way they do and why people, it explains the fortunes of the unlucky and why people get lucky, etc., etc. You know what I'm trying to say.
It's just that I could see that someone that wouldn't know anything about science, I can see that they would come up with an idea like karma. So we have something like the gambler's fallacy. It's been red 5 in a row. It's got to be black this time. It's got to be black this time. And even though it's like a 50-50 chance, they're perceiving it as like a 15% chance that it's going to land on the same one. And we have things like the Monty Hall problem, where just failures of human cognition. And we have the fact that the brain adapts to new stimuli in a way where, like drinking, the first drink of your life is like practically a transcendent experience. It's just wow. And then you have one every single day and your brain adapts. And so you start extracting less pleasure from this activity. And if we didn't understand brains and we didn't understand about neural adaptations, this would be a bit of a mystery. Why is this not as good as the last time I had it? It's exactly the same. Why is it not as good? And if we knew absolutely nothing about the brain, about neural adaptations, I can see somebody coming up with a theory, a hypothesis. I can see someone coming up with a hypothesis where they try to explain why that is. Like there's some kind of force that's like a feedback from what you're putting out. And because we can, so what I'm trying to say is that there's lots of times where something has a maybe not an equal and opposite reaction, but something has a reaction that feels like karma, and so someone who has delighted in the suffering of other people publicly, not Harvey Weinstein, publicly delighted in the suffering of other people, they tend to get their comeuppance. And so we can evaluate that like, okay, well, what's literally happened there is more and more people have seen what this person's done. More and more people have gotten motivated by anger to do something about this person being a sadistic bastard. And we can say, well, this is literally the reason why this person has had their comeuppance. Just as a simple, I guess, matter of statistics, that you keep increasing the amount of people in the world that hate you, you increase the likelihood of them getting retribution on you. So that's a fact, just of like statistics of sociology. And I can see that someone would who just, they can't really deal with numbers, they can't deal with statistics, they can't deal with conceptualizing wider society, would come up with an idea like karma to try to explain that. And I mean, obviously it turns out karma's wrong. The universe doesn't work that way, but I mean, it could. I mean, we know that it doesn't, but why not? I mean, we could design a universe that works that way. There's no reason why it couldn't, other than the laws of physics. But there's no reason why the laws of physics have to be what they are. And so something like karma, I would see more as like a pre-science, like a debunked scientific theory, more than actually a religious belief.
Well, the thing is, the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. I mean, Sam Harris is a good example of someone who describes religious systems as sort of pre-science, or a first attempt at science. He's also a proponent of, natural selection as is, and someone who opposes multi-level selection. So it could be the case that because these cognitive functions are so fundamental to the way we think and the way we behave, that, I mean, it obviously is the case that they shape the way we interact with the world, and they shape how we perceive the world. So it's not hard to imagine how religion would become entangled with what we'd think of as science now. So, I mean, it could easily be the case that religion was, as well as being a spandrel and a byproduct, also a first attempt at science. So I don't disagree with you.
Okay, so I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is, what stops? Not what stops. Why is karma a religious belief, in your opinion? What would you use as the defining criteria for why that is a religious belief? Other than I mean, like, we're dealing with like sort of the definition of religion here, and like sometimes people just sort of describe religious belief as a belief without evidence. And so, they're like, believing in crystal woo-woo quantum healing is a religion. And it's like, is it? I mean, but religion also doesn't have to be organized and systematic. It doesn't have to
believing that Elvis is alive. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that could be a religion. That could be a religion.
No, I think I see what you're saying, but I don't really think that, as someone who's arguing that religion is a byproduct of baser evolutionary adaptation, I don't necessarily think that there is a reason for anything people believe religiously. I mean, it could be the case that, people find utility in it and they start to shape it. I mean, that's obviously the case. It becomes modified, but I think you're making a distinction between religion and spiritual beliefs or supernatural beliefs, and I think they all come from essentially the same place, whether or not they have specific characteristics. Whether or not there is a God figure at the core of it, or if it's just a belief in some sort of force or process. It's all of
Yeah, like that's why I tried to define it as a force, a belief in a force that you can't see.
yeah,
Because that I tried to include things like Scientology, like because I know a fair bit about Scientology. There's a lot of misconceptions, and one of the things is that they don't
yeah,
worship aliens. It's funny.
yeah,
It's funny, but they don't worship aliens. The whole religion is about the existence of the thetan, which is basically a soul, and
yeah,
about the health of the soul. Which
yeah,
I mean, there's no God, and there's no intelligent agent with a mind, but there is a force, and that force is your thetan, and that
yeah,
qualifies as religion. I mean, I think Scientology specifically, the story of how Scientology became a religion is just a complete joke.
yeah.
But
Of course,
yeah, but uh, just for our purposes, that qualifies as religion because it's a belief in a force. And
yes.
so, what I guess I'm not seeing where um I'm not seeing where a religious belief that doesn't actually have a force with a mind, so a god, even if it's like a sort of Deepak Chopra god quantum of pure consciousness or whatever, even if it's something
Yeah.
like that, I'm not seeing where karma or the Scientology thetan qualifies as a result of hyperactive agency detection.
Well, it's still an attempt to explain what's going on. I mean, I think you may be defining agency a little too narrowly. I mean, and for good reason. I mean, there's a reason the word agency is what it is, but I don't think that hyperactive agency detective is narrowly restricted to an embodied or unembodied
Hang on,
sort of
are you,
figure.
are you saying white people can't be agents?
Of course I am. Of course I am, Kyle. Yes, that's another debate for another day.
Oh, this debate is so white and male.
Way too white and male. Three males. Where are the women? Where are the Muslims?
Oh, I'd love to
Where are
get a
the Muslims
Muslim
to
on
talk
here.
about? Yeah. But yeah, I think that hyperactive agency detection just means that you're more likely to attribute some
Cause?
sort of reasoning, yeah, like a cause, whether it be supernatural or banal and earthly, or you're more likely to assign a cause to something that doesn't necessarily have any significance, and that cause could be a force or process that, while not an agent by you know the standard definition, it's still a force that results in change and order, and
So
that regulates.
would you describe gravity as an agent?
No, I wouldn't. No, but I mean, I'm not saying that the word agency should be modified to include something like karma. I just mean that perhaps the the term hyperactive agency detective was a little, you know, imprecise. That what what people are reading into certain effects are causes that aren't necessarily there. It doesn't necessarily have to be an agent that they're seeing or believing.
So what leads to a belief in a life after death? Because I mean, for me personally, when I used to be religious, which was years ago now, the biggest thing that kept drawing me towards religion and away from a lack of belief is I really, really wanted to believe in a life after death. I
Yeah.
I can say that I was probably afraid of death, but I was more afraid of a really bad life after death.
Yeah.
And I mean, I grew up with some really horrible sci-fi and existential kind of movies that gave me a lot of ideas of some pretty worse fates than death. And so,
I need to scream, but I have no mouth. Is that what you're referring to?
that would be like the perfect one, but I didn't actually find that until only a couple of years ago. I was already an atheist by the
Yeah.
time I found that one, but God, that one would have given me a nightmare.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have no mouth and I must scream. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Totally
Yeah.
reversed the title.
Yeah. So, I mean, chimpanzees don't really contemplate. They don't seem to appear to contemplate death in the way we do. And I know we can't ask them, but we don't see them behaving the way we do. And so one of the things that people do when they contemplate death is they get depressed. And sometimes they commit suicide. I mean, there's an entire philosophy out there of like ephalism, which is, like similar to the Buddhist idea of like existence is suffering. And so, obviously, we're more intelligent than a chimp, but a chimp is not considering ephalism. A chimp is not considering suicide. At least I tried to look up suicide in animals, and I couldn't find any instance of it. And I just think that it's extremely possible that religion could be like a plug. Maybe not an adaptation per se, but it could be a plug for a kind of existential dread that comes with high intelligence that we don't really know what to do with yet. I mean, one of the things that becomes obvious with humans is that in a sense we're too intelligent for our own good. The classic example is biological warfare, chemical warfare, new and inventive ways to torture each other.
We are victims of our own success.
Yes.
Yep.
I can just see that the kind of intelligence that we have just hasn't had enough time to smooth out around the edges. That you sort of we haven't had enough time to evolve into a kind of mature intelligence. I mean, one of the things you could most easily characterize us as a species as is immature. I mean, I mean, we go to, even today, we go to war with each other all the time. I mean, it's better than it's ever been. But like tribalism and ego, we just can't seem to get away from things that we know we shouldn't actually be a slave to. And one of those problems is death. I mean, I can just imagine a different species that's as intelligent as us, but that isn't afraid of death in the way that we are. Once it ages beyond 30 and has a couple of kids, because I mean, as an organism, you've done your job, you've passed on your genes. Your immortal genes are secured as best as you can. You can die now, but we don't want to. And we're afraid of dying. And I just think that, can you really call it a spandrel if it's actually a plug that keeps bottled up, well, not bottled up, but keeps us protected from a kind of nihilism and existential dread and depression that we very well seem to have a propensity to slide into without religion.
Yeah. Well, something I have a lot to say about is the idea that religion serves as a sort of balm in the face of death was the topic of the article "The God Gene," and it's something Pinker responded directly to in his article, "The Evolutionary Psychology of Religion," and he talked about how it, religion generically, or the religious impulse generically, doesn't necessarily entail any specific beliefs. And I think we can all agree that specific beliefs can't be selected for. So there are no specific aspects of religion that can be selected for.
You mean at the level
And
of a gene, right?
yeah, of course. Yeah. And but yeah, I guess
Is
this
that
is
true?
presupposing, like election, but hear me out. Uh so what what was being selected for, assuming that religion was being selected for, couldn't have been a sort of in an afterlife that would just it would sort of that aspect of religion would come afterwards, and when the religious impulse was modified by culture. And Judaism is a very good example of the fact that religion doesn't necessarily entail a belief in the afterlife. It wasn't until the New Testament that there was a clear picture of the afterlife painted. And and yet the Israelites were a very successful tribe according to the Bible. I mean, there's obviously a sense of community. They outcompeted other tribes regularly. But I guess what I'm saying is that there doesn't seem to be any reason why religion would be necessary to assuage fear of death in the first place, especially when you consider that a fear of death is adaptive itself. I mean,
It is, but it has to
think
be
about
rational.
what do you mean?
Well, I mean, our fear of death isn't entirely rational. I mean, like, there's this. Have you seen the show? Just quickly, this show called Dead Like Me.
No, I haven't.
Okay. Well, long story short, it's about the Grim Reaper, basically, and so she is tasked with removing someone's soul before they actually die. She doesn't actually do the killing, and
Yeah.
there's an episode where she fails to remove someone's soul before they die, and in the canon of the show, this means that the person is stuck in their body even after they're dead.
Mm-hmm.
And so they feel they like, I mean, if I was attacked by a lion and I didn't have a gun and I didn't have a friend to help me out, I didn't have David over there with his cool 1776 musket to help me out, then
You got one of those ones?
I'd want to die as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you don't want to be alive. I mean, what do we always say? This person's being eaten alive, or this antelope it's being eaten alive. That's a fate worse than death. In that instance, you want to embrace death. You don't want to fear it. But we seem to, like, obviously I haven't been in the position of being eaten by a lion, but we seem to be afraid of death at all times.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's rational to I don't think that our algorithm that we use to measure how afraid we should be is really rational when it comes to death. It's not rational when it comes to it's not rational for most things, but I think that our fear of death is just not aligned with a rational view of how afraid of death we should be. And I mean, people just looking out into the world, and I know this is post hoc, but just looking out into the world, people who have a belief in the afterlife don't seem as irrationally afraid of death. I mean,
Yeah.
you have transhumanists that are trying to extend their life to 1,000 years plus. You have people that want to like upload their brains. And
Yeah.
me personally, I don't know if I want to do that. I mean, the idea of living for 1,000 years sounds great, but
Yeah.
I that experience is just so unimaginable that I don't want to risk what that could possibly be like. And in that instance, it's like I think I'd rather just die than take the chance of having no mouth and needing to scream.
Yeah.
And
Well, I think you're giving your. I think part of what you're saying speaks to my side of the argument, because it may not be rational for us to fear death to the extent that we do, but from a gene's eye view, it shouldn't be, because the only interest, the only motivation a gene has, if I can, anthropomorphize a gene for a second, is to get itself into the next generation, right? And so we could be, so a lion could be eating us alive, and we'd still be clinging to that last desperate hope to survive, and that's because we have this biological imperative to pass our genes along. And I mean, it seems perfectly reasonable to me that we would care so much about surviving if what's being selected for is, that that motivation to pass our genes along at any cost, because that's exactly what natural selection is. It's our genes trying to get into the next generation. And so, if we're being eaten alive by a lion and somehow we happen to survive for another 10 minutes, it seems like the most, from the view, the best thing to do would crawl over to the nearest female and reproduce. Because I mean, I totally understand what you're saying, but it doesn't have to be rational for it to be an adaptation. And it seems strange that we would remedy an irrational fear of death with an irrational belief in an untrue proposition. The rationality of the thing isn't what makes it plausible or implausible. Also, I just want to draw an analogy. Like, imagine we're on the African savannah, right? And we have this intense anxiety about snakes. And obviously, we want to avoid snakes. We've adapted this innate fear of snakes for a good reason. But imagine our anxiety about snakes became so intense that we had to adapt this untrue proposition about snakes being friendly, just to assuage our anxieties about snakes, right? And it's not, we don't just believe that snakes are harmless, but we believe that they're friendly, like a domesticated dog. I mean, it would deal with our anxiety about snakes, but then we would have absolutely no fear of this thing that we have evolved to be afraid of for a very good reason. And it seems to me that a fear of death is even more crucial, I mean, in general, avoiding things that could kill us so that we can get our genes into the next generation.
Yeah, I do agree that a fear of death is perfectly rational in and of itself. I'm just trying to kind of say that what our mind seems to do doesn't seem to always match up with what would be the most rational thing to actually, the most rational way to actually perceive the world. And obviously, like the hyperactive agency detection itself is not, it's not entirely rational in the sense that the algorithm is wrong.
Yeah.
You're going to be wrong more than you're right, which we would call a bad algorithm, but evolutionarily, that's what we need because just statistically, that serves us better. So I mean, I'm not. I know that the rational decision is not always the correct, not correct, but the rational decision isn't always the best decision to behave according to. But it just seems that cultures that don't have religion just they seem like they're missing something. I can't really think of a other than like since Darwin. I mean, since Darwin, as Dawkins says, and I totally agree, it was the most plausible belief was creation before Darwin.
Yeah.
And since then, we actually have a viable alternative. But I mean, you look at something like, it was maybe not Marx, but religion being the opiate of the masses kind of rings true, especially when you look at, I mean, how many atheists out there are not SJWs? I mean,
I don't know. I mean, I honestly don't think that we have the numbers to decide something like that. I'd imagine a good percentage of atheists are SJWs, but
the correlation is fucking there, eh?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think we all agree that the SJW ideology is just going to drive civilization off a cliff.
But you've gone from religion as a balm for death to religion is necessary for running society or civilization. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm trying to say that it just seems like the human mind can't really function without it on a large scale. People like us that... fuck, now I'm going to sound... Hang on, let me get my fedora. I actually have one not that far. But, I mean, people like us seem to get by without religion just fine. Why?
Yeah.
I mean, I have my reason. I'm sure you do. I don't know if you guys have always been atheists or not, but there does seem to be a difference between people who are always atheists and people who are atheist converts. But,
I was always an atheist, except for a brief phase. I'd say about when I turned 18 till about maybe 20. My mom sort of found God, and I joined the army, and she kind of had me convinced. I sort of experimented with it, but it never felt right. And eventually as soon as I went to college, I was like, oh yeah, this makes no sense. The more I learn about science, it was so easy to just drop it.
No, that's pretty much my story too. For whatever reason, I decided to give religion a try at around the age of 20 because my girlfriend at the time expressed some interest in Christianity, and so
I thought you were going to say some nun role playing.
Yeah, I couldn't do it. I mean, I really sincerely
sure, baby,
tried,
whatever you want,
But I think that some of us are just. Richard Dawkins actually makes the argument in his book that, with regards to the tools we would have needed on the African savannah, atheists are ill-equipped to survive. That we would have been picked off. We were the ones that were picked off, by the predators because we didn't assume that every noise made was a predator. But of course, it's also our propensity for thinking critically questioning establishment, et cetera, that has allowed us to progress as, as a species. And
Yeah,
that's a world that's certainly more amenable to.
yeah. I mean, I've always been, I guess, a skeptic. But the thing is, I mean, I literally have a poster behind me that says "I want to believe" with a UFO on it. But
Well, that's yeah.
I mean, I am a massive X-Files nerd, but that that really is that really was me up until about the age of 21. I wanted
Yeah.
to believe, whether it was in
Yeah.
Bigfoot, government conspiracies, religion, um, the health effects of coconut oil and cottage cheese. I wanted to
Yeah.
believe. But at the same time, I've always had a deeply skeptical mind where I was always asking questions and always getting frustrated by not being able to find the answers that I felt that I felt should be there. And it was when I discovered the tools to actually ask those questions and find the answers that I became a atheist, skeptic of everything. Well, skeptic doesn't mean non-believer. Like, I mean,
Skeptic
aliens.
should mean that you scrutinize
Yeah,
everything
yeah,
without prejudice as much as you can.
yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
And it's kind of come to mean non-believer, depending on what the context is. So, like, you have
Yeah.
UFO believers and skeptics, and it's like, well, okay, that's not accurate. So, I mean, I'm not really a believer in much other than things that you can prove.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, what about me? Would I have been picked off the African plane?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, you seem like you could, under certain circumstances, be susceptible to a form of teleological thinking. So, I mean, being raised in a culture where, really defined person had defined how you behaved, whether or not you were an adult, I mean, yeah, even if you didn't, it's very likely that, religion would have defined you so deeply as a person that would have held the community together. And it sounds like I'm making an argument for the utility of religion, but I think that a narrative would emerge regardless of whether or not we had ever evolved religion, defined a culture or a society together. And people define themselves by that narrative. And I think ultimately that's what holds a community together. I mean, just that
Narrative.
singular identity. And I don't buy that religion is necessary, specifically an untrue belief and a list of propositions. And I also don't believe, we were talking about death before. I wanted to address that. I forgot exactly what it was I wanted to address, but I know it was really important. So
the reasons I should be terrified of it.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I also don't buy the idea that was so debilitating that it hindered our survival as a species. I mean, I can say subjectively that most of the time I push thoughts of death out of my head, and it doesn't affect me on a moment-to-moment basis. It doesn't affect me at all, and I'm an atheist. I mean, I'm convinced that once I die, right? I mean, if a fear of death were the source of so much anxiety that you were paralyzed by fear, then I shouldn't be able to live a normal life. And I don't know any atheist who is so paralyzed by his or her fear of death that they can't go out of the house. They're not. I know one person who suffers from agoraphobia, and the Asian lady, and sort of thing can happen to anyone, and it doesn't necessarily result from a lack of belief in an afterlife. That the fear of death was so powerful that we needed to develop some sort of adaptation to deal with it.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking at the sum total of all of the ways that the human mind works that
So religion is a sort of package deal that deals with all of these specific individual problems.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like an analogy. I'm trying to think of an analogy. Like a leash, maybe. Like it keeps our mind on a leash. In a positive way, like the way you keep a dog on a leash so that it doesn't run into the crocodile infested river,
Yeah.
And that back before we had the precise tools that we have, I mean, something as simple as sticking your hand under something to have a look, at least here in Australia, could be a deadly proposition. I mean, we have freaking deadly spiders all over the place. So just sticking your hand under a rock could kill you. And then, we develop a tool so that we can lift that rock without having to stick a hand under it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
I just want to say that in Australia, HAAD is definitely a survival factor.
Yeah, no. It's a common misconception that, we developed HAAD in Africa. It came from Australia. It's a retrogressive, retrospective adaptation.
Yeah. So I'm also looking at a correlation between religion and conservatism. I mean, conservatism. I'm not a conservative. I don't think I am. I don't think any of us are a conservative. But I think we're not opposite of a conservative. If there is such a thing that's a perfect opposite to a conservative, because it depends what you're talking about. Depends what you're conserving.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So we're not opposite of a conservative. So we're at least a little conservative. I mean, we want to conserve free speech. We want to conserve science. We want to conserve
Enlightenment values in general.
Values. We want to conserve the atmosphere. So I mean, we're kind of conservative, and I just see that the correlation between religion and conservatism, and the way that a lack of conservatism totally seems to drive people off of a cliff, like SJWs. It just seems like religion just seems like a leash for the worst of our impulses. The worst of our impulses that can easily be dampened given the circumstance. I mean, I have absolutely no compulsion to stick feces in my mouth, and that's a good thing. But there are some people that wouldn't really mind, and that's not very smart. And there's the fact that there are people out there that either don't have this disgust module at all, or that somehow are able to get around it, just kind of shows how plastic our mind is. And I see religion as being a kind of like the binds on a bonsai tree. And Jonathan's left us.
Oh, wow. What happened?
I don't know. Let me see. Is he offline?
Hello.
I might be back.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, that was mightily inconvenient.
Okay, what was the last thing you heard?
I heard something about the correlation between conservatism and religiosity.
So you didn't hear me talking about feces in my mouth.
No, I didn't.
Okay, well let's just I'll just cut that out of the edit.
Yeah,
That never happened.
just heard a lot of feces coming out of your mouth.
Yeah,
This whole conversation.
exactly. No, my point was that like conservatism seems to be highly correlated with religion, and it seems to be highly correlated with disgust, and that it seems like disgust seems to be something that we can get around. And so the example that I gave was feces, that some people just don't see a big deal about like putting it in their mouth. I mean, I think I don't have a baby, but I can imagine a baby doesn't really think it's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is disgust of feces something that has to be taught to us, or is it something innate? I mean, the smell makes me kind of retch if I get like if I step into a portable toilet like at a construction site and get a good whiff of all the the fermenting waste. It's just, ugh. But is that something that's innate to our biology, or is that something that's learned? Because I get that reaction to vodka. And I get that reaction to vodka because I learned that reaction, because my first hangover drunken experience I ever had was on vodka, and I just had so much that I was just sick for like the next 48 hours.
Yeah.
And so I've learned that behavior to be disgusted by the smell of vodka. And it just seems like disgust seems to be a huge feature of religion. The meme of be disgusted of this, be disgusted of this, be disgusted of that. And so it could be a powerful tool for transmitting information about what to be disgusted by. Like, I mean, an obvious example would be the Abrahamic religions and their disgust of, their prohibition of pork. You have to cook that right.
Taboos are based, or they use disgust to kind of enforce taboos.
Yeah. And so for a lot of the things that religions preach disgust of, there seems to be a rational reason for it, but it's not something that would probably be instinctual information. So being worried about shellfish and pork would be like the obvious examples that come to mind. I mean, eating bovine meat isn't that big of a deal raw, but eating pork definitely is. And so, I mean, we don't know that instinctively. And so I think that religion could easily be like a solid vehicle for transmitting that kind of information without actually having to like explain to people why they shouldn't eat it. The dogmatism of religion could be an advantage over other memes.
Yeah. Well, disgust is largely innate. I mean, there are certain things that we are naturally disgusted by, and there's a reason for that. But there are also things that we can learn to be disgusted by. We probably wasn't necessary to be disgusted by the taste or smell of vodka during the most critical stage of our evolutionary history. But obviously, if it's something that doesn't agree with your body, you're going to develop that reflex quickly. And I don't think it's necessarily the case that religious people are more prone to disgust than anyone else. I just think that what they're supposed to be disgusted by is more, it's more precisely defined. And so people are disgusted, religious people are disgusted by shellfish. You gave that example. Pork.
Gays.
But they're gay people. There are
sorry, David,
specified reasons. Yeah. But yeah, all those things are delineated in their foundational texts, so they know exactly what they're supposed to be disgusted by, and they're motivated to be disgusted by those things by, their belief in the divinity of such and such. And so, I mean, it's interesting. I remember, I think Sam was talking. He had someone on his podcast he was discussing this with. I think it may have been the Very Bad Wizards, but he's talking about how sort of, emotional disgust is built on the same machinery that triggers, actual physical disgust. And so it could be the case that progressives, people who of a more liberal disposition, they're more prone to emotional disgust than physical disgust, which is an interesting idea.
Oh yeah.
But yeah,
That's gross. That's racist.
yeah, exactly. And but it's not
That's
necessarily the
actually
case that they're.
I actually never thought of describing their emotions as disgust, but I guess it kind of is, isn't it?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah, I never thought of describing it that way.
Yeah,
I always just conceived of it as like moral outrage.
yeah.
But
Moral
yeah,
outrage.
the reaction is disgust, isn't it? I mean, like Ben Affleck's face. I mean, he looked like he'd just swallowed a lime. It was like this squint, like, oh, that's gross,
Yeah, no,
man.
it's disgusted. He was
Yeah.
totally disgusted by that
That's
argument.
right.
He
And
didn't understand.
I mean, they do use the word disgust, like someone, says something sexist. Oh, that's disgusting. You disgust me.
Yeah,
Yeah. I don't know. I just never took their words at face value. Not that I was
Yeah.
reading anything in particular into them, but I don't know. I never perceived it that way. But that's interesting. Yeah. So they're just disgusted by different things, like
yeah, just exactly.
like if you're progressive, you're disgusted by someone that is, I don't know, overly conservative.
Yeah,
And if you're
yeah,
conservative, you're disgusted by someone that's overly progressive, like
Yeah.
that trans racialism, and I identify as a 6-year-old girl,
It's discussed based on behavior that is acceptable or not,
Yeah.
right?
yes, yeah, exactly. A taboo, like you said. And liberals are creating new taboos every day. So they have a lot to be disgusted by.
It's now taboo to say that.
Yeah,
While we were talking, they just passed that motion.
yeah, no describing liberals as disgusted. That's a microaggression, right?
Yeah, microaggression. What
I think that's like a macroaggression.
they're micro disgusted.
They're what?
They're micro disgusted.
Micro-disgusted.
I always say that if you're microaggressed, can you please get micro offended and shut up?
Yeah, yeah. I've never thought to say that, but I just might now.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't.
That is a fair point.
I actually
Yeah.
don't get accused of microaggressions because I just come all out with it and just offend them.
Yeah, no, I can't help myself either. Like the moment someone says something like that to me, it becomes my mission to offend them as much as possible, to
Yeah.
say the worst thing I could possibly think of.
Oh God, I know. Yeah, well, it's coming up on an hour 24. Believe it or not.
Is it
Yeah, I've got the timer on here.
interesting?
I mean, we could probably talk
Yeah,
for
we
ages. I'm cool with, continuing to talk, but I think that even an hour 24 is going to test the limits of the patience of anyone watching, if anyone watches
Yeah.
at all. So,
Well,
yeah, I'm cool with conceding defeat and drawing the debate to a
it's not
close.
necessary. Well, yeah.
It was a very valiant effort on your part, Kyle.
I tried. I tried defending a position I don't even hold. For anybody listening, we planned this in a way where I was gonna defend a position that I don't even hold, because if something goes wrong, if I lose, if it's boring, if we get heated and pissed off at each other, no big deal.
Yeah.
And
No, it made for some interesting discussions, I thought.
yeah,
Well, thank you.
um,
I thought it was interesting. Yeah, I really enjoyed this discussion.
yeah.
I just,
It
yeah.
honestly, I haven't really argued devil's advocate many times, and so
Yeah.
it felt kind of weird, but I could probably get a bit better at it. It did feel awkward because, like, when I speak, there's not I don't filter my thoughts really. They just kind of appear in my brain, and then I just kind of say them. You know, lack of free will and all. But
Yeah.
like, I have to like think of, okay, what would a person who believes this say?
Yeah.
And so it's a bit harder, but
No,
yeah,
it is very difficult. I've tried it before.
yeah,
It's really hard to defend a position you don't believe at all.
yeah, and I was trying to learn about the evolution as an adaptation model. I was experiencing some serious Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah.
The Dunning-Kruger nosedive, like when you sort of start out and you sort of think, oh yeah, this is all right, and then you read a bit more, and
Yeah.
then more and more and more, and then it's like, oh my god, I knew nothing.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, that's exactly my experience.
I experienced the Dunning-Kruger nosedive.
Yeah. It's an ocean of information. Like there's so much there, it's so dense. That's
Every single image is so dense. There's so many things going on.
No, it truly probably allows you to strengthen your own argument, find any weak points, and
yeah.
just educate yourself on the issue beyond, before. So it's got to be nothing but productive.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Well,
And,
so
you know,
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
what? Go ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna say, yeah. So I might end the recording
Mm-hmm.
before we reach the actual hour 30 mark. So if anyone's watching, listening, thank you for listening. Thank you to David for his valiant effort at moderating. His first time.
Yeah.
It's our first time doing anything like this.
Yes.
We definitely plan to keep this series up. Next time, hopefully, I'll be actually advocating for a position I actually believe, so that I might be a little bit more energetic. And,
Yeah, it should be fun, and we will open up the process to others who are interested through the group.
Yeah.
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 Definitely.
So yeah, we'd love to host some more debates like this, and I'd even say debates better than this. So yeah, I think this has been a valuable experience, and so thanks for listening. Thanks to you two for participating, and until next time, this has been the Future of Reason podcast.